Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess game. Today we're going to do something a little bit funsy, for those of you that like opening theory. About a dozen years ago, I wrote a Novice Nook called What Would Houdini Do?, where I took some of the most common opening positions in chess early in the opening, and I basically gave the position to Houdini, and I said, what move would you play here, Houdini? Which line do you like? And at the end of the Novice Nook, I said, it'd be interesting to repeat this again in 10 years when the computers are even better to see what they would do then. So that's what I'm going to do here. We're going to take some common opening positions, and we're just going to ask Stockfish 14, which is the best engine that I have here, what it would do in that position. And I'm going to probably show the top 3 moves, and we'll learn something by how much difference there is between the moves. For instance, if there's very little difference, then it doesn't make much difference and it's not that critical. If there's more difference, then we'll learn that, maybe you should play this number 1 move or maybe these top 2 moves. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to just go through the openings and just try different things. Right now, while I've been talking, I've let Stockfish think in the opening position. Let's flip the board so white's at the bottom. Game flip. And Stockfish says at 33 ply, he likes e4 the best, and he thinks black should play the French, which is interesting since the French is not the most popular opening at the Grandmaster level. He thinks the second best opening is to play d4 when black would play knight f6, the Indian defense. And the third best move for white he says is knight f3, which he sees transposing into maybe a queen's gambit declined or a Slav. All right, so let's try a few of these openings. Let's ask Stockfish what he wants to do. All right, let's say you play e4, e5, knight f3. And black has to decide, do I want to play the standard knight c6? Do I want to play Petrov's defense? Or maybe something else like a Philidor? Okay, so we can see already Stockfish is up to 27 ply. Stockfish says, it's pretty clear to me that you want to defend with knight c6. If you want to play the Philidor with knight f6, the Petrovs with knight f6, that's okay too. 5/100ths of a pawn less right now. But anything else like the Philidor with d6 is definitely inferior. Now we're talking about an advantage for white of 0.72. All right, let's say black does play bishop c6, and now you want to know, should I play the Gioco Piano like the Grandmasters are doing now? Should I play the Scotch? Should I play the Ruy Lopez? And we'll let him think again for maybe 26, 27 ply. And right now, Stockfish is thinking that it's best to play the Ruy Lopez, which is bishop to b5, give you an advantage of about 1/3 of a pawn, bishop c4 about 0.2, and anything else like knight c3 is even lower at 0.12. Let's say you do play the Ruy Lopez, and let's flip the board here. And the question is, the Berlin defense is really popular, but a6 is the main move. Which one would you play, Stockfish, if you had the choice? And Stockfish is thinking right now, and right now they're pretty close. They're both at 0.41 at 26 ply. So he's saying it's a flip of the coin right now between Berlin and classical Morphy a6. And the third best move, bishop e7, which is a move that you never see Grandmasters play, is actually kind of hanging in there as, well, now it just dropped down at 0.68. Well, 0.68 is not very good. So Stockfish is saying maybe Berlin number 1, classical a6 number 2, but not much of a difference. Bishop e7, kind of a distant third. All right, let's try some non-double e-pawn games. We already saw that after e4, Stockfish was looking at maybe playing e6 here, but he says it's close between e5, c5, and c6. I'm sure e6 is close also because we saw in the previous one that after he thought for a while, he actually kind of liked e6. But he's saying if you want to defend against e4, Caro-Kann here is holding his own. e5 like the Grandmasters play. c5 like the Grandmasters used to play. Those are holding on to the top 3 right now. All right, let's play Sicilian. All right, and now should white play the open Sicilian, knight f3 and d4? Is that the main way? Is that the best way to play against the Sicilian, assuming you know all those myriad lines that you could play? Or are you better off just avoiding the open Sicilian, even if you know it, because there's other lines that are better? And right now, Stockfish is saying, no, open Sicilian is the best that white can do. And he's saying white has an advantage of about half a pawn after knight f3, d6, d4. Okay, so let's assume you do that. Knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. It's pretty well known that knight f6 is the best move here. If black plays anything else, white can pretty much play a Maroczy bind. And you can see that's held up by the numbers. I see a lot of my students in this position playing things other than knight f6, which forces white to play the knight in front of the c-pawn. And you can see there's a pretty big jump down after knight f6 to the second best move, knight c6, which indeed allows white to play c4, as you can see right here. All right, so indeed the main line knight f6, knight c3 is right for black, and now black has those four choices: Dragon, Scheveningen, Classical, or Najdorf. And it took grandmasters a while to figure out what they wanted to do here. It wasn't until after World War II that Najdorf decided that maybe a6 was the most accurate. And since then, Bobby Fischer and Kasparov and Anand and a lot of players, Magnus Carlsen, they all like to play a6, which gives them a sharp game. But what would the computer play without any book in it? And look at it right here. This is really interesting. Stockfish is saying that, yes, without any book, I think I would like to play the Najdorf at 0.35 with a6. Second best right now is about 2/10 behind, which is Classical, knight c6. Then the almost non-move h6, which I've never seen anybody play, is hanging in at third. Well, what does that say about the Scheveningen e6 and the Dragon g6? Stockfish is saying those are really kind of inferior openings. For instance, let's play e6. The move that grandmasters are afraid of here is g4. And Stockfish picks up on that right away. g4, and he has white's advantage all the way up at 0.9. Well, we could see why modern grandmasters are not about to take up the Scheveningen anytime soon here. With this g4 move coming in, if you've never seen this, g4 threatening g5 is already causing problems for black. How about the Dragon? If somebody plays the Dragon, what does he want to do for white? Well, he agrees on that Yugoslav attack kind of idea. f3 or bishop e3 followed by f3. Let's just play it. Bishop e3, bishop g7, f3. Let's say, and here the normal move for black is castles. He doesn't even have castles in the top three. He's got h5, kind of a Andy Soltis kind of move, but quite a bit earlier. Knight c6 and a6, the Najdorf, as being the top three. What does he say about castles? He says, well, white could play that queen d2 move, which is the main move here against the Dragon. Or he could even start playing g4 right away. And if white does play queen d2 and black plays knight c6, in the old days we used to decide between castle queenside or bishop c4, with maybe a third idea being h4. But you could see that Stockfish thinks that what white probably should just play is g4, right away. And he's got white ahead by 0.87. That's a monster lead. If it gets anywhere around 1, we're starting to think it's a winning position already. So he's thinking that in this line of the Dragon, black's already in some trouble, and he'd like to start with g4. Interesting with g4, he says black should play h5. And now instead of playing g5 for white, which closes it off, just keep it flexible with h3. And he's got black's disadvantaged all the way down to maybe 0.5 here. So let's go back a move. Now he's rethinking it. Maybe he says he has better than h3. But he's hanging in there at about 0.5, 0.6. Now he's back up to 0.8 with h3 again. He has g takes h5 is almost as good. All right, how about if your opponent plays the Caro-Kann? e4, c6, d4, d5. Should white play the advanced variation? Should he play the Panna-Botvinnik attack? Should he just play the regular exchange variation? Or should he play the classical knight c3? We'll let Stockfish decide what he wants to do. Stockfish, what do you want to play against the Caro-Kann? He's going back and forth here. For a while he had the classical knight c3. Now he's looking at maybe e5. Now he's back to a classical line with knight d2. Knight d2 and knight c3 often transpose because after knight d2 or knight c3, black plays d takes e4, and then knight takes e4, and it doesn't matter whether the knight came from d2 or from c3. And right now that line is holding into a very small edge as number one. e5 is hanging in there at the second best idea. And the idea of trading pawns and playing the Panna-Botvinnik attack, or the exchange variation, hasn't made the top three so far. So what we're seeing is classical lines number one, advanced line is number two. All right, that's it for the Caro-Kann. How about the French defense? All right, French defense, you play the main line d4, and now you've got the choice of the exchange variation, the advanced variation, which a lot of beginners like to play, the Tarish, which is the line I like to play, and the classical knight c3. All right, white is looking, and Stockfish is looking at what white should do. Right now, it's got white at about 0.4, and it's holding close between the advanced variation, which is tricky for white. I wouldn't advise playing the advanced variation unless you know some of the lines, because it's real easy for black to get equality or better with black if white doesn't play the right ideas in the advanced variation. Right now it's a pretty close race. The advanced variation is holding on to a lead of about a tenth of a pawn over the classical variation, and the exchange variation is down at 0.2. My Tarish opening hasn't made the top three in all the time that I've been talking, so the computer's not all that hot on my knight d2 Tarish variation. But he does say if you know that e5 line, then you're okay. But you have to learn it. Again, I see game after game after game each year where people play the advanced variation for white, and they don't know it very well, and they get into trouble, and they end up with really bad positions by around move 10. Wow, look at that. The exchange variation has moved up to tie for first here, 0.30, 0.29, 0.29. There's almost a dead heat now between the exchange variation, the advanced variation, and knight c3, the classical line. And right now, knight c3 is threatening to take over first again at 32 ply. Knight c3, e takes d5, e5, e takes d5, says 0.38, but he's not done the 32 ply. And the fact that he's lowered it means... and there's the Tarish making his first appearance at 32 ply. The Tarish is now in third place ahead of the exchange variation, only about 0.1 behind the leader, which is the classical. Okay, what other lines can we look at? Well, let's not spend too much time on the rare lines. If someone plays the Pirc defense, knight f3, knight c6, g6, what line do they like to play for white? A lot of beginners just play knight f3, and then they play something like bishop c4, which is a little dangerous, and then they castle kingside. Bishop c4 is a little dangerous because after black castles kingside, he can play knight takes e4, knight takes e4, d5 with the center fork trick. So right now, Stockfish is looking at f4, which is the Austrian attack. We haven't seen the Austrian attack much in the last 20, 30 years, but it was very popular when I started. And now he's got bishop e3 and queen d2, which is the 150 attack. That was not very popular when I started, but now it's very popular. And Stockfish says, I can see why it's popular. Play bishop e3, queen d2, get ready to castle queenside. If he castles kingside, you can send a big attack over that way because you're castle queenside. So bishop e3, the 150 attack, and f4, the Austrian attack, are hanging in there 1-2. And look at what's number 3. It's h3, the prophylactic move. The idea of h3 is when you play your bishop on e3, he can't play knight g4 and harass the bishop. It's not necessarily to prevent bishop g4, although there are some lines in the Pirc defense where black gives up the bishop pair, plays bishop g4, then bishop takes f3, and then plays c5 or e5 and attacks the dark squares because there's no knight on f3 to guard those dark squares. And black tries to grab those squares with moves like knight c6 and e5, and maybe if d5, then knight d4. So h3 actually kind of stops that. But the classical knight f3 has regained its position here as number 2 against the Pirc defense. All right, let's try Alekhine's defense. e4, knight f6. Of course, e5 is the main move. Let's just play it. Knight d5, d4, d6. And now white's got choices. He can play knight f3. He can play e takes d5. E takes d6. Or he can play c4. So that's really the issue here. This is kind of the main idea. And Stockfish says that all three of those ideas are close. He's got c4 right now at 0.74. He's got e takes d6 at 0.5. He's got knight f3, which is maybe the most common move, at 0.64. So he thinks all the main lines against the Alekhines are pretty good, and we're seeing numbers up around 0.6, which is why, of course, the Alekhines is not the most popular opening among the top grandmasters. You occasionally see them dabble in it. There actually was, in the Fischer-Spassky match, there was at least one Alekhines defense. I think Fischer played Alekhines defense. And it was a very, very interesting game. Was it game 13 of the 1972 match? Not sure, but it might be game 13. Okay, so that's it. Let's switch over to d-pawn openings. d4. All right, should you play a Indian defense or should you play a classical d5? It's going to be pretty close, I would imagine. And it is, and they can transpose in some lines. So right now we've got a 0.37 versus a 0.36 versus the offer to play the French defense with e6, which is at 0.44. It's playing c6, offering a Caro-Kann or a Slav, is hanging in there. So right now it's all pretty close. All right, so let's pick it. Let's say somebody plays the Queen's Gambit against you. We know that knight f6 is a pretty big mistake. You know, we've seen that in some of the earlier videos. If you don't believe me, you can do it yourself, or you can, check out my earlier video called The Most Common Opening Inaccuracies. So the big three are the big three right here. c6, the Slav, e6, the Queen's Gambit declined, and d takes c4, the Queen's Gambit accepted. Notice they're all pawn moves. So if you ever get in this position as black and you're not sure what to do, pawn moves are the answer. e6, c6, d takes c4. Does Stockfish have a slight preference at 28, 29 ply? The answer is it's almost identical between e6 and c6, Queen's Gambit decline and Slav. And a little further back by a tenth of a pawn or maybe two is the Queen's Gambit accepted. Okay, if somebody does play the Queen's Gambit accepted and you're white, let's flip the board. Is it better to check and get the pawn back right away? Is it better to play e3 and try to get the pawn back? Is it better to play knight f3? Is it better to play e4 and get the big center? Grandmasters usually like to play knight f3 here, followed by e3. Stockfish says, I know e4 is complicated and it's a little bit harder to play, but if you know all these lines, it's just about as good as the main lines. Right now, knight f3 is hanging in there at 0.56 at 29 ply. e4 is number 2, and that's pretty much the order in popularity is knight f3 is number 1, e4 is number 2, and they're fighting it out. Stockfish now at 30 ply has e4 back on top, and the passive e3 is hanging in there at 3rd place. Notice after e3, black should immediately play a break move c5. If you play e3 and black doesn't play break moves, well, then you're okay. Wow, look at that. e3 is up fighting for number 1 now. e3, e4, knight f3, all within 3/100ths of a pawn at this point. Okay, let's try something else. Let's say black plays an Indian and white plays c4. Should black go for a Nimzo Indian or maybe a transposition into a Queen's Gambit with e6? Or should he play like a Grunfeld/King's Indian with g6? Stockfish says the classical lines with e6 and c6, intending to play d5, are the best. It likes e6 right now, heading for like a Nimzo Indian or something. It doesn't like g6 as much. It's behind by a couple tenths of a pawn. We know computers don't like the King's Indian that much, and we're seeing that right now. G6 and bishop, and the Grunfeld and the King's Indian are a little bit below. So let's play e6 and play knights. Here he actually likes knight f3, and the Grandmasters have picked up on this. They play knight f3 now and g3 more often than they play knight c3 and allow the Nimzo Indian. So you can see here, knight f3 is the slightly better move. Right now it's only about a tenth of a pawn above knight c3, but we see that more and more in modern play, that knight c3 allowing the Nimzo Indian bishop b4 is pretty good for black. So avoiding it with knight f3 and making him play a Queen's Gambit or a Bogo Indian or a Rogozin system or something like that is probably a little bit more accurate. So knight f3 is holding its own here, about a tenth of a pawn over knight c3. But what if black does play g6 and you play knight c3 for white? Should black, let's flip the board again, should black play the Grunfeld with d5, or should he play the King's Indian and allow him to play e4? Well, Stockfish has a pretty big say on this. He says Grunfeld is only down by about 0.3, but if you play bishop g7, allow him to play King's Indian, you're down by 0.78. So Stockfish has a very strong opinion, and now he's saying, he's saying Grunfeld is better by over a third of a pawn here. So he's saying if you are a decent player and you have a choice between a Grunfeld or a King's Indian, if it was up to him, he would strongly suggest playing a Grunfeld with d5. By the way, the Grunfeld is one of those openings you don't just fall into. You have to kind of study it. It's not the kind of opening that beginners accidentally play. They accidentally play the Marshall variation, which we talked about a couple minutes ago. You see them accidentally playing d5 here, which is a mistake because of pawn takes knight f3 followed by e4. But when they play g6, knight c3, you don't see them kind of accidentally playing d5 here. It's funny that d5 is such a big inaccuracy if you play it on the previous move, but once the pawn is on g6 and the knight's on c3, now it actually is the main move. So, yep, so it looks like the Grunfeld is number one. All right, let's see, back to the Queen's Gambit. Suppose white doesn't know about playing knight f3 here, and instead he plays knight c3. Should you try to hold the pawn with maybe c6 and b5? Stockfish actually says you can play a6 here with the idea of maybe holding the pawn. See, he wouldn't do that against knight f3. Knight f3, a6. If e3 and b5, now white can play a4, and if black plays b4, there's no knight to hit. So in this position, black's got a problem. He's going to be pretty much losing his pawn back with a bad game. For instance, bishop b7, he says white should break up the pawns with b3, and now there's just no way to hold on to all those pawns. You're going to lose a pawn here. And white's going to get a good game when you bring it back. For instance, knight f6, b takes c4, b takes c4, bishop takes c4, and black has two isolated pawns on the queen side. White has a strong center. White has two center pawns against one for black. Why didn't black try to stop that? Well, he really can. If he takes over, if instead of knight f6, if he takes on b3, you take on b5. If he tries to take back, you could trade rooks. Then you hit him with a check. If he tries to put the pawn in the way, you can just put your bishop back. And now this pawn is a goner. If black tries to hold it with queen b6, Stockfish says you could play knight bd2 and go after the pawn right away. Or you could just castle. For instance, knight bd2. If he plays here, Stockfish says, oh, I'll sack the bishop. Play queen a4, hitting your bishop, which is trapped. If you check me, I'll just put the bishop in the way. If you try to save the bishop with bishop here, I'll castle and threaten rook to b1, skewering all your pieces. And even though black's up a piece, he can resign. I've never seen this line before. This is kind of fun. Okay, so anyway, if after d4, d5, c4, d takes c4, knight c3 makes it a little harder for white to get the pawn back, as we just saw. That's why Grandmasters play knight f3, or even that sharp line e4. After knight c3, black can think about doing these kind of things because he can hit the knight. So again, these are the kind of things that you can learn when you just get out a good engine and just play around with it and say, you know, what line would you play here? I don't know what line I want to play in this opening. You know, we haven't looked at every single opening, obviously. You know, for instance, if someone plays the Benoni, knight f6, c4, c5, what should you do? Well, Stockfish says it's clear, grab the space with d5. Suppose black now says, good, I love to play the Benko gambit. Stockfish, how would you play against the Benko gambit? He says, I would take the pawn, and if he plays a6, he says, I'm debating between just playing e3 and guarding my pawn, or taking the pawn and then playing something like e6. So again, you can get some ideas from the engine on how he wants to play the opening this way. And again, we haven't looked at, you know, we looked at some of the most popular openings today, but we certainly haven't looked at all of them. But you can ask the engine questions and get ideas on what you want to play, and, you know, why can't I do this? Why can I do that? And all we did was spend 27 minutes here in the video asking, you know, what would Stockfish do? Which lines does he like? Which ones do he like better and why? And we could ask him questions that way by just getting the top 3 moves. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed today's video. What would Stockfish play in the opening? Please tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess. If you'd like to subscribe, that's great too. Like the video, sure, hit that like button. We'll see you next time. Bye.